Hey everyone, welcome to Stream today. We are continuing a series that we started last week about building a Jamstack app using Eleventy. If you're not familiar, Eleventy is a static site generator, and I happen to be just a bit of a fan. I'm the author of a site called Eleventy Rocks, and what I have pulled up here is a article about creating your first basic Eleventy website. And I wanted to bring this up sooner than later because the topic that we are discussing today and in this series is a much more complex and kind of intermediate skill level topic than you necessarily have to do with Eleventy. So in this article, it will show you how to do a very essential Eleventy website. And the important takeaway that I wanted to share is that at its core, Eleventy does not require you to know anything about JavaScript. However, for our project today, we are going to be writing some JavaScript just because, again, we have a bit more complex use case. But if you just kind of have a general curiosity about Eleventy, this would be one article to check out. You can also go over to the homepage, and there's some other beginner resources, including a quick start 3-minute video and a pro course on Egghead that's about 20 minutes. So just wanted to point those out as available resources to you if you want to follow up and learn more about Eleventy after this stream. But definitely let you know that, again, this is a more complex topic than you necessarily have to do with Eleventy, but that's kind of why we're doing this topic. So let's get back into what this project is. We are building an Eleventy-based RSS reader. And our goal with this is to show off Eleventy's features, but also show how when you think of a static site, it doesn't mean that, you can't have current content. But what does that look like? Sometimes the architecture of pulling in dynamic content can be a little bit complex. And so in my personal history, I have a background working on a pretty complex Gatsby site. And so in the back of my mind doing this project, I kind of have that, vibe in mind where this is a much different process. One thing I love about Eleventy is that it is fairly unopinionated. Some folks prefer more opinions, prefer more structure, like initial architecture, to be provided to you. And Eleventy, as we'll learn particularly today, lets you kind of freeform all that. It gives you the tooling and the build process, but beyond that, you get to mold it to what works for your project. And again, personally, I'm a huge fan of that. It's why I love Eleventy and continue to promote it and continue to build with it. So this is our third stream in this series. You can catch up on the other two as replays. But we started from zero. So when we very, very first started this project, we were just kind of talking about what is an RSS reader, right? So even though we're building an RSS reader, the benefits of this project is learning more about bringing data into your project, working with a concept called pagination, which we'll really get familiar with today. And then ultimately, when we are done with the architecture of our app, we'll get into styling. If you're not familiar with me, I run a blog called moderncss.dev. So styling is something that is of particular importance to me, CSS, and pop in that link in the chat. But we will conclude with that part of the project as well. So with that all said, you can see that obviously on screen, I will also pop this in the chat. We did go ahead and start a repository for this project. So you can go and check that out. This has our progress from last time, which essentially what we did in the previous stream was get our initial Eleventy build kicked off. And you can see up here, let me zoom in a little bit. We did generate this off of, I have a starter called the Eleventy SaaS skeleton, and we created this repo with that template so that we had some of those build processing steps in place, even though we haven't actually started styling yet. So that's what's going on here, and gave us some of our items. But after that, the only thing that we really did is we started to talk about the concept of the Eleventy data directory and how we can drop in like JSON directly. You can export data as a module. And Eleventy will automatically recognize this as a data source that you can use throughout your templates and layouts. So what we did so far in this project is we selected an existing package that can parse RSS feeds. And the one we selected was specifically one that would handle for RSS 2.0, as well as Atom feeds. And I was able to do a test, and it does seem to handle okay for podcast feeds. So in other words, it should handle most feed types that we throw at it. And so we didn't get very sophisticated on where we left off last time. We essentially copied and pasted the demo code from this feed parser package. And what we were able to do with just their copy pasted code is initially we were just console logging out this data. We were just making sure, are we getting something? What is the kind of shape that it's taking on? And just kind of getting familiar with what that package is going to provide to us. And so you can see I have some to-dos here. I wanted to leave those since I was pushing it up to the repo. I didn't want anybody to think this was ready to be picked up and used. So what I have done since the stream last time and today is, since this stream isn't intended to teach you JavaScript or some of these kind of fancy fetch things, I went ahead and tested and validated and wrote all that. So we're going to look at what we have just simply for pulling in data. We're still going to go through and really thoroughly look at how do we then take that data and turn it into our content that we need. So we'll do a quick overview of the updates just to our file that's intaking content from our RSS feeds with the help of this feed parser package. Okay, so I just kind of collapsed some things so we could read it a little bit easier. And the first thing I did is I added a few more sources, and I reformatted it to mimic the shape that we are expecting to ultimately create when we create a better way to organize these sources. So for now, this is just where we're starting today. So you can see I have a few different categories, and then I'm just throwing in the permalink to the RSS feeds for those sources in this items array. So following that, we're looping through those sources. And what the goal here is to create a combined data source. Because remember, we are in our feeds file, which is in the Eleventy data directory file. And that means that in our templates, we're going to be able to call this feeds variable and get this final returned array of all this content, which is exactly what we want, so that we can use it in our templates and layouts. And that'll make probably more sense as we go along and see how that actually happens. So the complex little part here is that we're passing each of these feed sources to our parse feed function. You can see that this is all promise-based, which is something I am not an expert in and had to fumble quite a bit to get this working, I'll be honest. So anyway, it's passing it in, and this is the part where feed parser is, let's get down to it. Feed parser picks it up, and this is all from that plugin we're really heavily relying on. It's going through, we've passed it a feed source, and it's going to create a final array of those feed source items. And what we've done to customize this is we're double checking that for each of those individual items, so like an article from those sources, we're double checking that it has a title and a date. So is this a valid like source that we want to pull into our project and to display in our reader? And then we're essentially customizing the shape of this data so that we are able to use it in our templates how we would like to. So we're essentially plucking out the bits of information that we want from the feed. We might decide to change this a little bit as we go on, but this is our starting point. And Starting with the feed source data itself. So this is going to be something that sits alongside every feed item just to make our templating a little bit easier down the line. So you can see we're getting the feed title, author, couple URLs. And then for each individual item, we're getting the title and date. And something we discussed when we were looking at our feature list, and as we were kind of discovering what's available in an RSS feed, is that not all RSS feed authors choose to publish the entire article. And we know that for our templating purposes, sometimes we want to show an excerpt, but we also do want to include a full article view if it's available. So for the kind of transform of the content we would like to use, we're going to create a summary key. And then if there isn't a summary already available from the source, we'll use that. And if not, what we've also included here is a custom excerpt function. This is just so that we can kind of reformat what is coming in, because again, RSS authors have full control over what that summary is going to be. So there's not like a consistent format. They may include HTML, they may not. So I'm going to scroll back up to our create excerpt function. It's just extremely basic. I'm sure there's improvements that could be made here. But it's essentially doing a really quick strip of most HTML content and then chopping it off to approximately 200 characters, making sure that that is not cut off between in the middle of a word. So we're just doing that again for our own formatting purpose to just bring some consistency to the excerpts that we're providing. Following that, we're going to, so in the RSS feed, the key for this is description. We're going to just change it to content. I think that makes it a little more clear what this is holding. We're getting the link, which would be the permalink out to that item. And then I haven't planned to use it quite yet, but there's a possibility that the feed would pass an image. So we're not quite dealing with those yet, but that's what we are grabbing from our RSS feed sources as a starting point. So once this transform all happens and we've pulled in our sources, for those that may be curious, here is just a pulled out snippet of what the shape of this data looks like. So we have a category for each of our provided categories. So we've kept that. And then for each category, there's a series of items. And those items are each individual feed source. And then the items within that are each feed item. So for this source, it would list all of their items. One thing we haven't quite done yet, and we'll look at maybe next stream, I have to research it a little bit more how we might go about it, is, and I'm open to feedback too, is some sort of limiting factor. Maybe as just like a baseline, we limit it to the most recent 10. We might do something like most recent since we last looked at the feed, so more like a new items concept, or maybe maybe it's just set at any items within the last month or whatever time frame. That's the part we haven't built into the feed quite yet. So right now we're going to get a dump of anything that's in that feed. And I've seeded it with feeds that are from content that's actually I'm involved with the production of. So I know that they're not too long of feeds that are coming in here. They're kind of a nice mix of content links for us to validate that data, that it works for, like I said, a podcast type. And also I know that there's code snippets in here. So when we look at the whole article coming in, how does those styles look to try to accommodate any sort of content that comes through the feed. So that's where we're at. That's what that looks like. And before we get too much further, I did create some wireframes. So these are not designs. I disclaimed in the last streams, I'm not a designer, but these are wireframes to help us kind of conceptualize the views that we need to produce for our RSS Reader app. And so definitely pipe in the chat if you have an opinion on what sort of content should be here. But these are the views we're going to work on creating today through the use of the Eleventy concepts of pagination and templates and layouts. So first I'm showing you the home page and the way I would like to consume this RSS app is that for each of my categories, it shows me each of the sources for that categories. And we're just kind of going with the idea of the latest 3 or whatever that might be for the source, or like an up to 3 items. Of course, the date is important on these when we're thinking about what the purpose of an RSS reader is. We're looking for freshness in the content. And if we are able to work out like the unread idea or the new since last accessed idea, maybe some sort of notification. So we're not going to actually worry about this part today. I'm just representing that this is a feature we might incorporate. And then there is a link that goes to the category view, or excuse me, the source view. So of course I duplicated my content here, but if I'm looking at modern CSS, this is going to take me to the source view of that. This title would as well, probably. And then if I were to click on one of the individual articles, I would get the full page article view within the RSS Reader app. And we'll look at that view in a minute. If I just want to do, narrow it down to just the category view, we're going to produce that as well. So in this example, we're in the CSS category. So similar example to the home page, we're just showing latest 3 or what have you for each source in that category. So we've just narrowed the scope a little bit. So it would be any sources in that category. And then the view for an individual source. So this would be moderncss.dev. And so finally in this view, I thought it made sense to kind of open it up so that we now get our excerpt in play. And one thing I mentioned in the previous stream as well is when we are complete with this project, that repo that we have out there, it will become a starter. So if you disagree with some of these views, once you've kind of learned how it all works, it is something where you can fork it or you can pick up the template and you can manipulate it however you want, right? So the awesome benefit of it being open source, and you can make any of these changes you'd like. But if you strongly disagree with anything I'm saying, we can try to accommodate that. Again, this is also intended to be an application for our own uses, right? So if this makes sense to me as a navigation pattern or a content consumption pattern, but the cool thing about this project is if it doesn't make sense to you, again, you can own it, you can continue manipulating that and change it into whatever views make sense to you. So I have kind of this to be determined. We're gonna see if we can somehow mark these as new, or provide a method for us to mark them like as ourselves consuming the content, mark as read. So we'll see about that, and if we get that figured out, we'll incorporate it into the UI here. But the other important thing here is we're including a link to view the original. So if you don't like the view of it pulling into our app, or maybe you actually, once you own this, you decide not to have that view at all, which would be completely fine. So in that case, you just switch this so that they all link out to the original source. That's what that's about. But if we do, we will assume that we're keeping the full article content in our reader. And so in that case, here's just, the starting point of that page. It wasn't really necessary at this point to mock up all the content that could come in. We'll get to that when we get to styling. And so we bring in the date and, again, our view original link. So that's the flow. That's what we're aiming for. All right, so looking back, I apologize for the scrolling across there. Now that we kind of know where we're headed with this project in terms of what we want to do with our data and how it's going to end up in our templates, let's look at what the output is based on what we have right now. So when we did our, when we left off last time, I'm going to jump back into the source and I'm going to jump to our index. We really didn't get very far. We weren't doing anything complex yet. We were showing just with Nunjucks, that's what this NJK file type is. It's the templating language Nunjucks. We just did a very, very simple feed, and it wasn't really what we wanted because we didn't have it fully formed into, the shape of each feed item that we wanted. So this was just kind of our testing place. So now one of the other items that I've completed is, now that we improved the transform of data from our different feed sources, let's look at what our loop looks like now. And we'll learn a little bit about reading this Nunjucks templating language. Eleventy has 10 templating languages available. Nunjucks and Liquid are the ones you'll see frequently in tutorials because they're kind of a priority templating language for Eleventy. There's a lot of other ones, so definitely check out the docs. And, I use Markdown a lot, but in terms of when I'm bringing in dynamic data and need some of these advanced features, I typically choose Nunjucks. So here's our vastly improved loop now that we have more shape to our content. So, quick recap, we are able to get this data because our feeds script that we have is within the expected Eleventy directory of data. So based on this file name, whatever is returned out of that is available across our pages and templates and layouts. So that means we can very simply loop over it by just mentioning that file name, which is awesome. There was no extra steps here. I don't have any other plugins installed. Nothing else had to happen. This is Eleventy giving this to us out of the box. Okay, so based on just a quick refresher, this is the shape that we're working with. So we know that our top level is categories. So we're going to loop through, we're going to output the category. And then for each category, we're going to output each source. And for each source, we're going to output each item. So that's what this loop is accomplishing. Oops, wrong file there. So you can see we're pulling out the category name. Then we're creating a list so that each category source has its own list. And then for each feed source, we are looping through its individual items. So let's see how that looks. So here's what we've accomplished so far. And I felt pretty good getting that far, honestly. Sometimes, excuse me, sometimes working on multi-level arrays is definitely can get a bit unwieldy, and it's definitely not my favorite thing to do. I feel like I forget how to do it every time I have to. But essentially with our Nunjucks language, you can see that our syntax for creating a loop is we just say for, we add our, preferred local variable for this loop, and then, whatever it's iterating against. So when we do a for loop, we have curly braces and percentage signs. But then when we switch to actually outputting one of the values within there, we switch to double curly braces. So those are the two little things to point out about the syntax we have going on here. And beyond that, you won't need to know too much more about the syntax of Nunjucks. But that said, I do have the docs ready over here. So I will go ahead and pop that in the chat. There's certainly a lot more you can do. And when you do have more advanced use cases, you may find yourself looking up more of these features. We'll talk about just a couple more as we continue along. But those are our main ones. We're mostly concerned about looping through our feed and outputting data. So that's great. This gets us that home page that we looked at, right? We've broken it up into categories, sources, and the items. Obviously, it's not styled, but this was successful. And, this could be your stopping spot, right? Since we're outputting all the available data. If you don't want the other views, you wouldn't have to create the other views. They're kind of a nice to have, and we're mostly going to create them to use as a, way to learn about working with these more complex data and pagination. So pagination is our next key term. I've given us just kind of an essential starting point for the HTML semantics. When we get into styling, we might revisit this and make some slight modifications, but it's a good starting point, I think. Cool. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is before we create our templates and layouts, um, managing the feed sources here is not the best, right? This is going to get a little chaotic. And so it'd be nice if we can separate these out into individual files based on category, or at least that's my initial thought of how to manage this. Since we're not having a database behind this, which is an important distinction too, right? We're not building an interface to manage our feed sources and all these things through a web interface. We are instead creating our application by configuring these opinions. So with that in mind, we're going to separate each of these categories into their own JSON file as a first step to improve our organization, make it more maintainable, easier to add sources, and certainly more scalable for making this work for us as an RSS app. So one thing about JSON is that it is not a recognized templating language by Eleventy, which the benefit of that is that we're going to, within our source directory, we're going to create a new custom directory that we're going to call feeds. And in here is where we're going to create a JSON file per category. So I'll start with my CSS, and I'm simply, going to just copy this out and into my source, right? And I will repeat that for each of these. We'll come back and clean up the format there. 11D, and finally podcasts. These steps that I'm going through right now are beyond what you would normally have to do for an Eleventy site. It's purely because of the unique complexity that we are creating with this app in particular. So I'm going to stop my build right now just so it doesn't keep, it's going to start having errors if I let it keep building. So we're going to shut that off just for a minute. And obviously now we have to figure out how to pull those back in. So one other resource that I have up here that we're going to borrow an idea from is I had this article out on CSS Tricks talking about building a community site. So another example where you have kind of these separated data files, perhaps JSON files, and you need to pull them together so that they become a data source for you. So I'll pop this link in the chat. And specifically, so this was about users could submit their dog or their cat for this weekly battle idea. And so we had a directory of cat files and a directory of dog files. And so we have an example in here of how to, using this package called fastglob, which I may have globally installed, or it may be with Eleventy. I didn't get an error, so I'm not sure which that is. I should have double checked. But anyway, it's able to pull those in, and we're going to loop through it and all that good stuff. So that's the functionality we're going to create. One thing about this is that because we have everything promise-based, and I get a little out of my depth here, but I was not successful in making this function be in a different file. And I'm sure I'm just missing some knowledge because this is not what I work with every day doing this kind of thing. So we're just going to keep it in our same feeds file, this new function that we need to create, to bring in and mash together those data sources. So first, at the top of the file, we need to bring in those helper packages. And then we're going to, again, mimicking off that function we just looked at, we're going to create this get sources function. So in our case, it's going to go grab all the JSON in our feeds directory, loop through that, and return that back out. It's going to return a combined array of all those feed sources. And so we can replace what we had before, where we were hard coding those sources in line, we can, sorry, I gotta get down to the right place here. We can replace that with waiting for that to happen with our get sources function. So we didn't change our variable name here to keep that simple. We're just changing how that data is coming to us using that function. So hopefully I copied and pasted that back in correctly. We'll start our project and make sure we don't have errors. Looks successful. Just going to refresh to make sure. And yep, we have the exact same thing that we had before. And so just real quick recap, we created individual files. And because of that globbing action, it threw those right back together again as an array, and it didn't change any of the behavior that we had already set up. So the shape of our data is the same and all that's the same. So what this means is that if you pick up this project, first of all, you can remove any of these that I have in here, but you would just continue adding your sources as items in here. One thing I also did is I considered using the file name as the title, but I want to allow customization of capitalization. For example, I wouldn't want to only capitalize the C in CSS, for example, if I tried to automate that off the file name. So that's why we've retained that variable in here, that key in here. But you could continue creating feeds and it would dynamically pick those up and add them as part of that array that gets pulled in and, any new sources there. So that's how we've kind of solved our organization and maintainability of adding sources. And a real quick recap of a point mentioned earlier, which is JSON is not a recognized templating language by Eleventy. Now, the importance of that is that if I open my public directory, so what is being output by Eleventy, we haven't had any files created. We looked at last stream that when we added an index file or whatever files, the default for Eleventy for recognized templating language files is that it will create a page. So based on file system creation. So we don't have that happen with JSON, and that's why we were able to safely add it in our source. We also didn't add it directly in the data. And the reason for that is that it would have been nice to do that. But that's the one instance where one data file can't call another in the same way that a template can call that data. If we could, we would have kind of changed how we manage this. But that's why we had to kind of do the glob thing to bring all these files together. Okay, let me check my notes so I don't want to miss a step. Cool. So we have our sources. We've made them more manageable. Sorry, I keep scrolling the wrong direction there. And so our goal now, we've essentially created this view. Again, not styled, but we do have the data necessary for this view on the home page. So our next step is to create the individual category pages. Now, when we created let me close out my open files here. When we created this loop on the home page, that worked really nicely for us because we were able to get the whole returned object of our feeds. That's exactly what we wanted because we wanted this view to start with the category and get all available information. And we wanted it to live on a defined page. We wanted it to live on the home page. So this was the easy step. The next thing we want to do is be able to create a dynamic category view for each category that we have available. So in other words, we don't want to have to manually create a page for a category and have to manually put in this loop. We want it to just happen, right? Because otherwise we're reducing the maintainability and adding extra steps. So fortunately, Eleventy has a concept of pagination. And pagination is an interesting name because certainly when I first heard of it, I'm thinking of, long article lists blogs that have lots of articles and you're paginating between them, right? You have a literal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, step that tells you how many pages. That's not what this is. It includes that sort of kind of as a feature in terms of giving you data to create something like that. But the real purpose of, or like the primary purpose of pagination is being able to intake data, which could be a data source. It could be something called a collection, which we're not going to get into with these streams. But it's another way that Eleventy manages data. So it could be your local data file, or you could actually directly supply some data to use, which is what's being used in this example. So in this case, they are outputting these items. We're going to pull in our feed source, and we're going to, let me find the right docs page. So we're going to do something more like this, where we've created our data file. Of course, ours is being created dynamically, but ultimately this is the type of thing we're getting out of it. And we're going to use the idea of setting the size to 1, which means create one output for each item in this data set. So the output being an actual page. It is a little confusing. We'll see how it works, and hopefully it will bring it together a little bit better. So again, our first one that we want to do is create dynamic category pages. So as I mentioned, by default, Eleventy is going to create pages based on file system page creation. When we do pagination, it's going to do it a little differently. But we need to have a file that contains that pagination code. So in our feeds file, we're just going to keep it in here to help us organize our application. Again, this is what I was referring to earlier, is where you can kind of mold Eleventy to what fits your project and makes sense for your architecture. So within our feeds directory that we previously created, I'm going to create one more directory called Paginate, just to clearly delineate that this is the purpose of the files in this directory. And so let's start with creating categories.njk. So this is where we'll put the important thing to paginate our categories. So as we saw in that docs example, our first important step is to reach out to our data source. So as we had mentioned before, this is based on the file name of our script file in our data directory, which at this point, when this file is receiving it through pagination, it is that returned full array ready to go. And so we're going to do a couple unique things here. The first thing we're going to add on to this is we're going to define the permalink for our category pages. So we're going to specifically say that they're going to all share this category base. And then we're going to pull in the category name, but you may be wondering, where did this variable come from? And so our one extra step within our pagination array here is we can alias out what is returned from our feed. And so this just helps you as make this more readable of what type of content's here. So in our case, it's categories that we're concerned about for this particular view. So we're aliasing the returned result here to categories. And because we know what that shape is, if you need a refresher, it's like this. So we're looking at this top level. So we're going to reach out to categories and grab the category name. And then we're using the built-in Eleventy filter of slug. So in other words, a filter is going to offer a lot of different features, but the slug feature in particular is going to lowercase the words in that string, add dashes, slugify it, right? So make it appropriate for a permalink. And I'm starting to lose my voice. Apologies. Hopefully I'm still understandable. So as this data gets read for any of the returned items, a page is dynamically going to be created with the base of category and then the dynamic name slugified of that category. So we're not going to see anything output yet. And in fact, I may have getting an error. It might just because I haven't completed what I'm what I'm putting in here yet. But we have a couple more things. When we did our previous stream, concept we just touched the surface of was the idea of layout, where any content that is in our template gets thrown into a layout, which wraps it up. And just a really quick peek at that, essentially what that means is we're throwing it into something that already has the HTML boilerplate. We have a spot for a title, and then this content variable is going to output anything that's not front matter. So anything in the body of the template. Okay, so we want to attach that for our categories as well. And as we kind of go through and make our views, what we might do in a future stream is change this so we customize what layout it goes to, but we're not quite there yet. We're just going to reuse our base layout. And then in order to set that title that we just saw, we're going to use a slightly more recent feature of Eleventy. So if you looked at Eleventy a few months ago, you may not have noticed that this was added, but this Eleventy computed allows you to define your own variables that should be pulled in. So since in pagination, we're already using front matter to define what pagination even is, Eleventy computed is the way that we still pass in some of those variables. So we didn't have to make any changes to our layout, but we're going to use the same idea here. Okay, so before I get further, let me double check that hopefully this builds now that I have that completed. And of course, I'm getting an error, even though it was all working last night. Multi-line key under, did I miss a, let me just copy and paste this whole value just in case I missed a dash. That'll do it. All right, there we go. We've successfully built it now. So what's happened, of course, we're not outputting any of the content yet, but let's just see what happened. In our public directory, it has created a category directory because of this base here. And dynamically, for each of our categories that we have available, it's created a page prepared for those. And it's empty now, although it did successfully pass in the title into our base layout. Cool, so we've got the categories set up. Now, of course, we want to populate it. And essentially, we're going to reuse the idea that we had from the home page almost exactly. We're basically just stripping out the top level that was outputting the category. And now instead, we're going to reference this alias of categories and loop through its items. And then based on our wireframe currently in this view, again, you might change your mind of what has to output here, but we're going to continue to show each feed in that category and all of its items. But very similar to the home page right now. We'll adjust this a little bit later, but we'll validate that this works. So we can see it over here in our output. But let's look at it on our actual application. So we haven't created the navigation links between here yet, so we'll just have to manually put it in. But for example, we'll do category CSS, and there we go. So good starting point. We validated that the pagination works. And again, that benefit of it being dynamic and not having to, for every time you add a source or every time you have to add a category to manually create those templating pages. And that's something you would expect, right? From something like WordPress, or when you add various plugins and things to something like Gatsby, right? Like this feels like an expected pattern and, or an expected need. And so pagination is the key to making this happen in Eleventy. Now, getting our categories was also pretty accessible, but we have created in our feed output this, multi-level, multi-dimensional array. So accessing these other items is not going to be quite as simple because we've already taken this top level item. And so how are we going to drill down into getting our other views that we want? So we want to do this same idea, but we want to create a view per source. And we want to go down to our last level and create an individual page per item. So for every source we have available, we want an individual page created. Before I move on, I wanted to also point out one more thing in terms of how this is outputting. And that is that using pagination, that content only is output to our distributed files. So in this case, our public directories, our distributed files. Those files are not created in our source. So if I were to open, we can kind of see the color coding here that's telling me modified versus new files in terms of checking that into Git. But you can see that we did not have a category directory created. In other words, anything created via pagination does not, by default, get added into your source directory. I believe the main reason for that is that if that happened, it would get double processed and actually cause an infinite loop, right? Because if it gets thrown into your source directory, then also gets output, you would constantly be triggering the watch command because of file changes. So it would cause an infinite loop. So I think for most use cases, this is ideal that it only gets created in the public directory, right? And you have access, as we saw, to change things like the front matter, change which layout it goes into. There's other things you can add here. The other main thing you might add here in a different circumstance is tags to create a collection out of this. And we're not going to quite cover that in this. I do have materials on that at Eleventy.rocks if you're interested in tags and collections, which is a really useful concept, just not for this particular application. Cool. Okay, so we have our categories created, but again, our problem now is how do we dive down into that next layer and create an output just like this, but for each source and also for each item. So as a starting point within our feeds and our paginate directory, the next thing we're going to attack is views for our sources. So for example, the way I'm using that term is to mean all of the individual feeds within a category. I'm calling that source. So we could call it feeds probably, but anyway, you can make that distinction if you decide to pick up this project and use it. All right, so for sources, we can start out really similar to this, but the problem is we need to figure out how to dive into that next level. And a more recent feature in Eleventy is being able to add in a function right here at this point to modify that data and change what is actually used by the pagination. Now the syntax for this is a little bit different. I'm going to copy and paste in the whole thing and then we'll look at it because we're also going a little bit low on time. I don't like to go too much over an hour with my streams. Okay, so I'm in my sources directory, and what you can see here is I've changed the format of this to JavaScript. And the reason for that is we've done the same thing as we did before. We had the pagination. We're still grabbing from our feeds the size of 1. And in this case, we've aliased that return data to a variable of sources. But critically, what we've added in here is this before function. And that's why we had to change the format here. So this before function is going to look similar actually to how we initially handled the data coming from the parsing in our original feeds file. And what's happening here is it's intaking, this is a local variable, so it's referencing this whole glob of the feeds data. And what we're doing though is we're filtering that down. So we're diving into that initial level, but we already dealt with that. So what we really want to do is dive into the second level that contains each source, and then from that point, push that available data. So finally, what's returned here is just this second level. So we're starting with now the source level and not the category level when we get down to the rest of the content to output. So we've done the same thing as before, but I made the decision not to give these a base. I'm just going to have it directly live off of the root. which we'll see how that works in a second. And we're still pulling in that title because that's still a part of our template. But in this case, we switch it to the feed title, so the source title. And same thing as we saw before, we're again just kind of scoping down this loop in order to output content. So now we're just looking in the source items. So here's what we're getting back. Let's go ahead and save. And you can see how quick that was, right? It was, well, it tells us right here. Not even a second, 1474 milliseconds, right? So previously we were directing our categories to go into a category. Now we've directed that the sources just live at the root. So you can see my Eleventy rocks, modern CSS, etc. So let's go look at that out on our local server. Let's go to word wrap, which is my podcast one. And there we go. So that again was successful. We'll come back and revisit what data gets output here. We're just sort of validating that the pagination is working. All right, so we have one last level, and you can probably guess that it's going to look very, very similar to this. We're just going to go our one final level deeper. So let me close these other files. And so within Paginate, we're going to add our last one, which is going to be called items. We'll copy in our Paginate functionality. Like I said, it's the same as we just looked at, where we're using this before function to help us drill down to the correct level of that returned entire glob of feed data to get the item level. So now we're only getting back an individual item. Cool. So the change here, we've done the permalink thing. Again, I'm having these live directly off of the root. Maybe we want to change that, but we'll start here. The difference is now I have no more data to loop through. Now I'm at my final level. And so what's going to change here, you've already passed in the title to be in the template. But what's going to change here is I'm just going to pull out the date. And then because we wanted to get the full article content, we're now going to put out that variable. And we see another filter here. And this save filter means that if there's any HTML in this variable returned content, which there will be, we're saying safe, which means don't escape the HTML. We want to actually render the HTML. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to see this public folder really, really fill up. Whoosh, lots of stuff here. Let's pick one that is going to be a little extensive. I'm picking one from modern CSS that I know has like images and code. So here we go. We have the full return content. If you missed my note earlier on stream, an RSS author may return the full content. They may return an excerpt. So we are going to see variability in this view. And of course, when we get to the styling portion, we're going to have to work out how much we decide to style things like code and of course images coming in and, you know, controlling some of these things and making it an enjoyable reading experience. We can see we got the title in and we got that date in. So we've created successfully all the views we set out to do. And for now, I think this is the easiest place to sort of recap that. We created our homepage view, which we just had to do a loop through our return data right in our index. And nothing unique beyond that. Then when we got into the rest of our views, we had to bring in pagination. We saw how for the category level here, let's look at that one more time. For the category level, we were, again, just able to pull in the whole feed because we were just looking for, we did want to output all that nested data. And so not too big a deal, kind of a essential use case for pagination. You can think of if you were fetching from a single API endpoint, this would be a similar way to handle that data if you weren't worried about any multi-dimensional functionality. Then we saw how with sources and our items, we changed our pagination format a little bit so that we could include this before function, which Purpose of that was to modify that original feed source, and so that we could return just the level that we were looking for this view type. So we had to go down 2 levels for our sources and all the way down to a 3rd level for our source items. Picking this back up will be improving the templates that we created here and double checking, like, do we have the data where we want it? But we'll also, be creating links between those views so we don't have to manually type in paths. And we'll also be looking at, can we do things like our, read functionality, some of those kinds of things. And so once again, I will be posting up these changes into our repo. So let me provide that link in the chat one more time. And you'll be able to see where we got to today and kind of follow along with those changes. I hope this was helpful. I hope you know some more about managing complex data in Eleventy and handling for pagination.